They say that the warp remembers everything, every scream, every prayer, every death, somewhere beyond the veil of reality, where light collapses into madness and faith becomes fuel for nightmares. Countless souls drift in the endless storm. Some whisper that they are gone forever, devoured by demons or dissolved into the tides of unreality. Others claim they still linger, fragments of once living minds echoing in that abyss, forming strange constellations of memory and agony. In the Imperium, death is not release, and it is another conscription. Even the soul must serve. Across 10,000 years, the Emperor's light has guided humanity through this sea of horror. But not all who die find their way to his beacon. Some are torn apart by the tides before they can even glimpse the Astronomican. Others are swallowed by the warp's predatory hunger, their essence twisted into things unrecognizable. To live in this galaxy is to gamble with eternity, for the warp is not merely an afterlife, it is a war without end. If the darkness calls to you, if you wish to know what becomes of those who vanish beyond the veil, stay with me. Subscribe, share this chronicle, and step further into the storm. What follows is not doctrine nor heresy, but fragments gathered from the lips of the dying, the sermons of the damned, and the data slates that should never have survived. There is a moment, too brief to measure, too vast to comprehend, when the soul still clings to the body but has already begun to drift away. It happens in the space between heartbeats, in the instant before the mind fades. The Imperium's theologians call it the liminal breath, a fleeting suspension between the mortal and the eternal. For the common soldier of the Astra Militarum, it's just the last sound they'll ever hear. The slow draw of air through blood, dust and regret. On the shattered plains of Barrisbine Borough, Trooper Dalen Core lay dying beneath a sky turned crimson by orbital fire. Around him the world was ending in silence, the kind of silence that follows the collapse of everything familiar. He had been struck by a fragment of shrapnel, promethium hot and buried deep in his abdomen. He could feel the warmth ebbing from his limbs as if the blood itself had accepted its surrender. Somewhere far above, the roar of engines and the thunder of basilisk shells echoed like distant storms. Yet to him, it all sounded like the sea. He had heard preachers speak of the Emperor's mercy, of the golden light that awaited all loyal souls. But as his vision dimmed, he saw no light. Only gray horizons, torn clouds, and the cold wind whispering through the broken manufactorum spires. The pain was gone, and with it fear, and that terrified him more than the wound. He wanted to feel. He wanted the pain to stay, to remind him he still existed. But the world was receding like a tide, and something vast was listening. A faint hum filled his skull. Not sound, more like pressure. A vibration that resonated with his thoughts as though the air itself was leaning closer. Cord tried to move his fingers, but they no longer belonged to him. The field around him shimmered, and perhaps heat haze, perhaps something else. He thought of his home on Kether Prime, the scent of machine oil and rain, the laughter of his sister in the Hab Block courtyard. He thought of the oath he had sworn beneath the Aquila, the words that had bound his life to the Emperor's service. In death duty ends. But as the light bled from his eyes, a question burned through his fading mind. What if duty never ends? Somewhere beyond flesh, a spark detached, imperceptible, unseen, but real. Every psyker knows the moment when the soul loosens its grip. It ripples through the warp like a scent of fresh blood in dark water. That spark, fragile as breath, begins to drift. And in that drifting, the warp stirs. To the untrained, the warp is chaos, a storm without horizon. To those who have touched it, even for a heartbeat, it is not chaos but hunger. It hungers for thought, emotion, memory. The dying provide all three. Each death is a flare in the dark, a signal that draws unseen predators. Demons, entities, echoes, and whatever names the ecclesiarchy assigns. They are drawn not by sin or virtue, but by intensity. A life lived in fear burns brighter than one lived in peace, and Core's fear, even in its silence, was enough to make the shadows move. He felt the temperature drop, though there was no air left to feel it. The hum grew louder, now filled with whispers. Not voices he could understand, more like the sound of prayers spoken backward. He tried to remember the words of the Catechism of Departure, the prayer every guardsman is taught for this very moment. O Emperor, receive my soul, for I have served and suffered in thy name. But the words twisted as he thought them, curling into shapes that were not his own. The warp had heard him, and it was answering. He saw shapes coalescing beyond his dying eyes, silhouettes that bent light, faces made of shadow and flame. They circled like carrion birds, silent and patient. Yet one stepped forward, not a demon of the monstrous kind, but something almost human. Its form was fluid, skin shifting like smoke caught in glass. Its eyes burned not with malice, but with recognition. It spoke without sound. "You are not yet gone." Kor tried to speak, but his jaw no longer obeyed. The thing leaned closer, its breath colder than void. "You called for him," it said, and though the words were felt rather than heard, their weight crushed him. He does not answer. Not here. And then for a moment the warp pulled him closer. His soul flickered, a candle in the wind. He saw fragments not of his life, but of lives uncounted. Cities collapsing beneath demon fire, pilgrims lost in transit, the silent halls of derelict voidships adrift for centuries. Countless deaths, each radiating the same light, the same cry, whining, and all swallowed by the same sea. He understood then what the ecclesiarchs never said aloud. The warp does not merely receive the dead. It consumes them, yet in that horror something resisted. A faint warmth pressed against him, a pulse of gold threading through the black. It came from nowhere, yet it was everywhere. The Emperor's light, distant, faint, but present. The predators recoiled, hissing in silence. The Shadow Man's face distorted, fracturing into mist. Kor reached toward the light, but it was receding as if through miles of storm. His body was gone. His memories were fading. All that remained was the will to hold on. But will alone cannot navigate the warp. Even the strongest psychers are torn apart without guidance. For the common soul, the Emperor's beacon is salvation only if the warp allows it. Kor's essence began to dissolve, pulled in a dozen directions at once. Fragments of himself, memory, sound, emotion, scattered like sparks in the gale. One fragment remembered his sister's laughter. Another, the oath whispered over his laser gun. Another, the terror of the moment the shrapnel struck. Each fragment drifted apart, seeking something to cling to, but there was only storm. And yet, amid that storm, something noticed. Not a demon, not a god, but the faintest pattern of recognition, as though the warp itself had paused. The fragments of Dalen Kor did not vanish. They began to swirl, drawn together by memory's gravity. In a place where nothing holds form, memory can be anchor and curse alike. The dying man became a constellation of recollection, flickering weakly in the void. It is said by the Schola Psychana that souls which resist dispersal are sometimes glimpsed by sanctioned psychers as flickering lights, faint voices in the Astronomican's tide. Most dismiss them as echoes, meaningless residue, but others whisper that they are the remnants of the lost, soldiers, civilians, martyrs, trapped between dissolution and deliverance, neither alive nor dead, waiting for a light that may never come. Kor's light burned for what might have been seconds or centuries. In the warp, time is irrelevant. His thoughts twisted upon themselves, replaying his final moments again and again, each repetition more distant, more hollow. He began to forget his name, his purpose, even his fear. Only the instinct remained, to be. And the warp feeds on such instincts. Something vast moved beneath him like a current shifting in a deep sea. His fading consciousness felt the pull, not violent but inevitable. The fragments that were Kor began to drift toward it, drawn as dust to gravity. He resisted, but resistance meant nothing. The warp was not cruel. It was indifferent, and in its indifference he was swallowed whole. In that final instant before the last fragment of thought dissolved, a single phrase formed, not from his voice, but from something beyond him. He remembers. Whether it was mercy, illusion, or the echo of prayer, none can say. But on Baraspine 4, as the firestorms cooled and silence returned, the air shimmered faintly where Kor had died. A low hum lingered, almost imperceptible, like the echo of a voice carried by wind. Then it was gone. For the Imperium, 1 billion souls die every day, their essence vanishing into the sea of madness. But for each one, there is that single heartbeat between breaths, the last flicker of humanity before eternity claims it. And in that breath the warp waits. The first thing the living notice when a soul passes nearby is nothing. Air moves, a vox sputters, a lumen coughs in its socket, and no one remembers that a heartbeat ago someone was still here. But there are people who do notice. They are the ones taught to listen for absences. On the Medici barge Sanctiveris, outbound from Baraspine's orbit with her holds full of the barely saved and the mostly dead, A sanctioned psyker named Ethos Vale paused mid-right and turned his head like a hound catching a scent. The Geller field thrummed around the hull in a steady, blessed tone. The navigator's wards were intact. The chapel incense stung the throat. Yet beneath all that order something rippled as lightly as a fingertip across still water. A passing, a flicker, then a cold chime that never quite became sound. Ethos closed his eyes and touched the prayer beads threaded through the brass ring at his wrist. The beads were smooth from years of fear and faith. He tasted metal at the back of his tongue, and unbidden, the shape of the void loomed, not as distance but as pressure. In the galleries below, Sisters Hospitaller worked by pale lumen under icons of the Imperial Aquila, whispering the catechism of departure into failing ears. Beyond steel void. Beyond void, the warp. Beyond the warp, only what they had been taught and what they had felt alone in the dark. Ethos did not seek the dead. He simply tried to make room when they brushed against him, the way one steps aside for a procession. Some presences pass like wind, others trail thorns. He felt this one like a handful of sparks carried in a sleeve. Memory clung to it, oil rain on a hab balcony, the sting of promethium smoke, a name that would not settle. He did what he had been trained to do. He did not grasp. He did not reach. He bowed his head and let it move past, shaping a space of quiet inside himself so the thing would not snag and tear. Even that was dangerous. In the warp, attention is a hook. The more you look, the more the abyss looks back. Below decks, in a ward made of curtains and whispered vows, a young trooper bled through a pressure tourniquet, while a sister traced a tiny aquila on his brow with a gloved thumb. She spoke of rest, of light, of duty ended. He blinked and tried to see the light through the steam clouding his breath. When the last breath left him, the ward grew no louder or quieter. Siring is rattled. A medici servitor rolled past with blood on its pale plastic lips. Outside the porthole, stars lay like salt on black slate. The sister felt nothing pass. She had felt too many pass to notice one more. And yet, in the machine hum behind the bulkheads, a pattern faltered and recovered. A tech priest paused in his recitation and tilted his head, augmetic eyes adjusting, cogitator spirits murmuring from their braziers. He marked the fluctuation with a servo scribe and chalked it to coil fatigue. The note would be checked, logged, forgotten. The Sanctiverus kept moving. Ethos did not. He stood in the chapel doorway and waited for the echo to fade. If he followed it, he would open himself further. If he opened himself, something else might notice him noticing. But the echo changed, and that was what held him. Not a thread unspooling, a whirlpool forming. The knot name turned within itself like a mote caught in a beam of gold. He tasted ash and old vows and the steady, stubborn flavor of an oath remembered after the tongue has gone cold. Too often the dying unwind into fog and vanish. This one tried, even after the body had failed, to remain a self. He stepped backward into shadow and let the chapel's incense work as ward and wait. He spoke, not words for the dead, which are the province of the priest, but a simple shape of silence. He imagined a door closed softly against a storm. He imagined a hand lifted without force. He imagined that if there was anything of the Emperor's light in the storm, not doctrine, not proof, only that warm thread the faithful know when they are most alone, then it could find this mote and carry it where men cannot go. He did not imagine that he was the one doing it. That way lies pride, and pride is bait. Across the ship, the confessor strode the ward with a lantern of veiled yellow flame. He was old and careful, which is to say brave in a way that had no heat left in it. He listened to the gasping and the pleas and the nonsense minds make when they are breaking, and he said the same few lines over and over, one for each, so none would suspect he was saying the same lines. When one more chest stilled, he dipped the lantern in a little bow and moved on, leaving a curl of warmed air over the cot. The living thanked him as if he had stayed longer. The dead did not need him now. If they needed anything, it would not be a man. Outside the armored glass of the viewing blister, the warp seethed. It looked like color and felt like thought. If you stared too long, you could not tell which was which. The Geller field made a clean sphere around the barge, a denial of the sea. Within that denial lay every human thing. Prayers, engine cycles, a sister's sore shoulders, the scrawl of a trooper's name cut into a bed frame with a mess knife. Without it lay appetite, contagion, idea. The predators of that sea were patient because they had no time to waste. They did not circle the Geller field like sharks around a diving bell. They existed as currents and harmonics, as invitations. They reached not with limbs but with likeness. A fear in here rhymed with a hunger out there, and the rhyme made a bridge. Ethos had learned to break rhymes. He made his thoughts ugly, off-meter, unrhymed. He mixed grief with boredom, awe with irritation, reverence with the memory of a stone in a boot heel. It worked, the bridge failed. The thing outside lost the scent. He felt the pressure ease, the echo pass like an old smell in a corridor you will not remember later. On Barraspine-Fou, where the sky had cooled from crimson to a smoke-stained bruise, the wind combed the ash and lifted it into brief ghosts over the trenches. A commissar walked the line with his cap pulled low, counting faces without letting his gaze meet eyes. He paused where the ash drifted and felt very faintly a sting beneath his sternum, the body's way of explaining the inexplicable. He told himself it was the cold. He told himself to keep moving. He did. He would never know that a man named Dalen Core had left his last breath here. The trench already did not remember where Core's boots had bitten the mud, but absence leaves shape. On the next barrage, when the Voxnet broke into clipped panic, a single channel cut through impossibly clear, as if a mouth spoke into the plug in a sergeant's ear. It said only 3 words, "Hold the line." The sergeant flinched, because the voice was familiar and because no one on his net had that tone. He did not repeat the words or question them. He planted his boots and did what the words told him to do, because that is what a man does when the world is screaming, and a small piece of it speaks calmly. Later, when he tried to call back that voice, he would think of the Habrain on Kether Prime, despite never having seen that world, and he would not understand why. Stories like that travel. They unwrap themselves and twist and tie again. Ithis heard one version months later in an orbital chapel above a different world, and pretended to believe it less than he did. The priest called it a miracle. The rating in the back row called it a glitch. Ethis filed it in his mind under a shelf that had no label. He did not forget the cold chime on the Sanctiveris or the way the echo had tried to keep shape. He wondered not aloud whether hunger is the only law of that sea. He wondered whether insistence can scar the warp the way a nail scars a deck, a small mark no tide will erase quickly. He wondered whether that matters. He had been told since childhood what becomes of souls. He had been told the words to tell the dying, and the gestures to make, and the way to close another's eyes with your thumb so the lids do not fight you. He had been told what to fear and how to fear it. None of those lessons were wrong. They were simply partial. The rest of the lesson is learned in silences and not shared. You learn that some passings are clean and leave no wake, and some carve bright, brief grooves that other men stumble into later without knowing why their footing changed. You learn that demons are not all fanged masks and stormfire, that some stand almost like men and speak gently and mean the same hunger. You learn that the Emperor's light is not a beam but a pressure, very faint, and that sometimes faint is enough. On Barraspine's plains, smoke unraveled into morning. The living counted losses and sent names back up the chain until names became numbers, and the numbers became a requisition for more men. Somewhere in that arithmetic an absence remained that did not belong to mathematics. A soldier's sister woke on Kether Prime with a taste of iron, and the certainty that she should leave a cup of water on the windowsill, though she did not know for whom. A Medicae servitor's cogitator froze for half a second and reset its tally with a subtraction that would not be traced. A litany learned in childhood fell out of a priest's mouth with one word missed and no one heard it but him. The warp is not a ledger, and yet it keeps the kind of accounts that bleed through paper. Ethis watched stars he could not name slide by and knew they were not moving at all. The ship trembled as it kissed translation. The Gellerfield sang with a note like hammered silver. He braced for the familiar pressure and found only the faintest ache and a memory of sparks in a sleeve. He did not think of it as hope. Hope is hot. This was cooler, a steadiness you can carry without spilling. He spoke a fragment of a prayer he would deny later if asked. He imagined a door held shut against a storm by an old man's hand. He imagined that sometimes, not often, the storm respects the effort. And if there are hunters in that sea, there are also tides. They do not think. They do not love. They move. They feed on thought because thought is what exists there. A man's fear sweetens the water. A woman's vow salts it. A child's curiosity gives it color. Souls enter and become taste. That is one truth. Another truth is that sometimes taste becomes pattern, and pattern becomes shape, and shape lingers long enough to be mistaken for a voice across a vox net in a trench a world away. Between those truths, men live and die and light candles and lock their doors and whisper to the dark, because there is no final understanding, and yet one must speak as if there is the other. Sanctiverus slid through the warp like a lantern with its shutters mostly closed. Ethus slept sitting upright with his beads tucked in his palm and dreamed no dreams he would keep. On Baraspine, ash drifted into the seams of the dead, shading their faces gentler than they had looked in life. Somewhere far from both, a current turned, and if a fragment of what had been Dallin core rode its edge toward anything warmer than hunger, only the current knew. If there was a hand in that motion, no one saw it. If there was a shape waiting, it did not declare itself. It is enough sometimes to say that the storm did not take everything. The warp has no ground, no sky, no air, and yet it moves like a storm. Not the kind that breaks upon the world with rain and wind, but one that exists between thoughts, swelling with every surge of emotion that living beings spill into it. To mortals, it is called the Imperium, the realm of souls, dreams, and nightmares. To psychers, it is simply the sea. A sea without horizon, without mercy, without end. In the endless dark beyond real space, the soul of Dallin core, or what remained of him, was caught in that current. At first there was nothing but drifting. No direction, no form, no sense of self, only motion. His awareness moved through tides that had no color, yet shimmered with every hue at once. He could not tell if he was sinking or rising. Every direction felt the same. The air, if it could be called that, was thick with soundless screaming, a million overlapping voices weeping, laughing, and praying in tongues that broke into static. He tried to remember who he was, but memory had become liquid. His sister's face, his regiment's banner, the feel of Lay's gun metal, all of it ran like ink in water. Only emotion remained. Fear, regret, duty. These became his shape, and that shape called to things that should never have names. Something brushed against him, soft at first like seaweed curling around an ankle. Then it tightened. A presence. It had weight, hunger, attention. The warp was not empty. It was filled with things older than time, born of the first thought that ever screamed. They drifted unseen until emotion lit them, and the lost soul of core burned bright enough to draw them close. The first came as a voice without source, a whisper that slithered along the edges of his dissolving self. It spoke in tones that reminded him of comfort, of his mother humming through static in the Hab corridors. "You are not alone," it said. "I remember you. I can make you whole." He reached toward the sound instinctively, not in faith, but in need. But the moment he did, the voice shifted. Its warmth curdled into laughter, its tone splitting into 1,000 mouths. Shapes unfolded from the darkness, faceless but full of intent. They were not beings in the mortal sense. They were reflections of desire, wearing his own memories like masks. They surrounded him, their forms flickering between familiarity and horror. His comrades' faces stitched into impossible geometries, their eyes mirrors, their mouths reciting prayers backward. They fed not by touch but by recognition. Every time he remembered, they consumed. Every thought he formed gave them substance. He realized too late that to think was to feed them, to feel was to let them drink. He tried to stop thinking, but the warp does not allow silence. Every attempt to quiet the mind only echoes louder there. His panic turned into light, and the light drew more. The sea boiled. The things began to sing. Their song was sweet, like choir voices in a cathedral made of fire. For a moment, Core almost gave in. But somewhere, far beyond the storm, a faint pulse of gold stirred. A distant rhythm that did not belong to the warp. It was faint, fragile, like the beat of a dying heart, but real. The Astronomican, the Emperor's beacon, even across the immeasurable expanse of unreality, the souls of the faithful can sometimes feel its call. It is not light. It is command, a singular will burning across the chaos, bending reality around faith. For those adrift, it is salvation, if they can reach it before the warp devours them. Core turned toward it, though turning meant nothing. He willed himself toward the rhythm, pulling against the currents that wanted him still. The shapes around him screamed. They clawed at his light, ripping away pieces of thought and memory. Each fragment they took dimmed him further, yet somehow made the path ahead clearer. Perhaps that was the paradox of the soul. It had to lose itself to find direction. He began to move faster now, the tide howling around him like a hurricane of voices. The entities followed, writhing in his wake. Their forms shifted into storms of teeth and prayer, into hands made of smoke. They called him by name, a name he no longer remembered having. Dalen Kor, they whispered, mocking and pleading. You are ours. You belong to the sea, but he did not stop. For every memory stripped away, a piece of discipline remained. The endless drills, the chants before battle, the command to hold the line. That last order became his anchor. Not hope, not faith, duty. The thing that survives even after belief fails. He clung to it, and through that act alone he burned. The light grew, not bright and never bright, but steady. The predators recoiled, hissing like embers dropped into snow. Some vanished. Others remained, circling, unwilling to give up the chase. And then, through the distortion, he saw them. Other lights, faint as stars, glimpsed through storm clouds. Souls, dozens, maybe hundreds, drifting together. Some moved with purpose, others simply floated, dim and silent. He reached one. It flickered like a candle. A woman's voice murmured inside it, broken, repeating the same plea again and again. Forgive us, Emperor, forgive us. Her words looped endlessly, stripped of context. She did not see him. She was no longer herself. A shadow of devotion burning on after death. He drifted past her, and the light faded behind him. Another shape loomed ahead, vast, impossible. A leviathan of thought and color, its surface rippling with human faces that appeared and vanished like bubbles in boiling tar. Each face screamed soundlessly, their mouths opening to reveal galaxies of teeth and flame. This was no lost soul. This was something older, something born from the feeding of countless lost minds. It was a predator in the truest sense, a demon, its essence made of faith corrupted, emotion perverted. It moved slowly, yet its presence filled everything. Kor's will buckled beneath it. Its voice crawled through his thoughts like rust. Why flee, spark of flesh? You are already mine. The words reverberated not in air, but inside his own fading essence. The pressure was unbearable. His memories cracked, scattering into shards of sensation. The crack of last fire, the scent of oil, the warmth of his sister's smile. All of it turned to ash beneath that gaze. In desperation, he reached for the faint golden pulse again, but it was further now, dimmer, drowned by the demon's gravity. His will faltered. The sea pressed closer. The creature opened what might have been its mouth, and a storm of screaming faces erupted outward, each one a soul devoured, each one begging to be remembered. He was about to give in, to let go and dissolve, when another sound pierced the void. It was not a hymn. It was not divine. It was the memory of a command barked through static. Hold the line. The same words that had carried across the Barraspine trenches after his death. They came from nowhere, but they were his. They were him. The demon recoiled, not in pain, but in confusion. The phrase cut through its song like a blade through silk. The echo of duty had power here because it was pure, unadorned by hope, untouched by despair. It was will, and will alone shapes the warp. Kor surged forward, the golden pulse flaring once more. The demon howled, the sea roiled, and for an instant everything was fire and sound. Then, a silence. He awoke within something else. Not space, not form. A sense of containment. Around him, the warp still churned, but the storm no longer touched him directly. He floated in a cocoon of dim light, translucent as skin stretched over bone. His thoughts came slower now, structured. The noise outside dulled to a whisper. The golden pulse beat faintly above him, and though he did not know it, he was following it, like a dying ember drawn toward a furnace. Somewhere on the Medici barge Sanctiveris, a psyker named Ethysvale awoke from a nightmare he could not remember. His lips moved before his mind caught up. He's not gone, he murmured, and then dismissed it as sleep madness. But in the depths of the warp, something had indeed refused to vanish. Kor's cocoon drifted onward, through currents of thought and memory. He glimpsed things no living mind should. Rivers of flame carrying the faces of saints, floating monoliths inscribed with prayers in tongues no human mouth had spoken in millennia, and colossal shapes that whispered to each other across gulfs of eternity. The warp was not only horror, it was also history. The history of every emotion ever felt, every death ever mourned, every prayer ever spoken. It was the ocean of the human soul, and he was now part of it. But whether that ocean would preserve him or devour him entirely was yet to be decided. The cocoon held, not by strength but by shape, a narrow geometry of will wrapped around a dwindling ember. The sea pressed, tested, suggested other shapes, surrender, sleep, the easy unspooling into warmthless dark. He refused without words. Refusal, pared down past heroism and fear, is only a small hard thing in the middle of a storm. It was enough to keep the walls from thinning. When the currents turned, the cocoon turned with them, and the faint pulse above, not light but a pressure like hands steadying a lantern, tugged him onward. He learned the tides by harm. When he drifted near grief, the membrane thickened as if soot had settled on it. Sorrow tried to seep through in 1,000 remembered voices. When he passed anger, the cocoon became brittle, ready to crack under the slightest nudge from some unseen beak. When awe washed past, the clean, stunned breath of a pilgrim seeing a relic for the first time, the cocoon ran clear and cold, as if rinsed. He did not guide. He endured. Endurance made a kind of seamanship, and seamanship was survival. There were other cocoons. They traveled in uneven flotillas, drawing together, then dispersing as eddies found and lost them. Some were bright and taut, hymns vibrating along their surfaces like harp strings. Others were flaccid and dim, their occupants already sleepwalking toward dispersion. Once a cluster drifted so close he could feel the friction of their prayers. The words had no syllables here, only shapes. Forgive, keep, remember. The shapes kissed his shell and left tiny indentations that did not fade. For a while after, the predators stayed distant. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps in that sea the trace of a plea can serve as ward as much as invitation. He saw wrecks, not ships, though broken void cathedrals cast their shadows in the warp like bruises. He saw the remains of vows. They lay like reefs, oaths sworn by regiments that died to a man, promises made in foxholes and heaved up to the sky with teeth clenched, bargains whispered in desperation and never fulfilled. Around those reefs, colors fumed and faded. Some oaths had turned poisonous, feeding things that wore the shapes of banners and saints until teeth showed between the folds. Others gave off a cool steadiness the predators avoided, as if disgusted by the taste. He skirted both, the cocoon trembling in each wake. At times he passed close to the shadows of Geller fields, and those were different. The denial they burned into the sea felt like a blank page, an absence so strict it had edges. Near them the tide smoothed. The predators thinned to thin threads of suggestion that would not quite cohere. He felt in those lee waters a familiarity that was not memory so much as habit. The rhythm of engine cycles, the steady throb of a ship's heart, the knife-clean music of sanctioned wards. In one of those calms he drifted near a boundary so sharp it rang. On the other side men breathed and sweated and swore, and somewhere among them a mind he half knew grew still for the span of a heartbeat and murmured, not in certainty but in courtesy to a passing, "He's not gone." The cocoon rang softly in answer, the way a glass answers a note across a room without ever having learned the song. Something watched that passage. He did not see it move. He felt the way space deformed when attention laid its weight across him. The cocoon's surface crawled with fine cracks that did not break through. The watcher was patient. It did not lunge. It leaned, the way hunger leans when it has all the time in the world. He felt it testing the shapes he could carry. It offered one, reunion, all faces present and smiling, all pain annulled, the warm table and the cup in the correct hand. He almost let the cocoon soften. He almost let the edges round. Then the tablecloth lifted in an unexistent wind, and the nothing underneath showed through like the open mouth of a shaft. He held. The offer folded back on itself and left only the watcher's regard, a blandness worse than malice. The crack sealed. The current tugged. Patience drifted off to find something easier to fit. He learned that the sea had seasons with no calendar. There were long stretches that felt like the echo of winter. Thought moved sluggishly, and the predators lay heavy on the bottom, their bellies full. Then came the thaws, and everything rose ravening. In one such rise, an impact shuddered the cocoon and drove it downward, if downward existed. He tumbled through a red-lit gewgaw of shrines glued to the flanks of a half-real leviathan. Its prayers were all teeth. Its eyes were choir lofts. It sang the names of saints until the saints bled. He scraped past and left a sliver of self in its gill rakers, a thread that played a note it could not digest. The thread sang hold the line as it burned. The burning took something with it he would never count again. Near the edge of that ruin he saw men. Not in bodies, but in the precise angles of their fear. A group of lights wavered together, disciplined even now, each pulsing in time to the others like a perfect drill. Their formation cut a wake through the bile. He drifted in behind them and felt the effort slacken for a few breaths. In their rhythm, a cadence sounded, a sergeant's bark counting off, a habit deeper than hope. It did not last. A ripple of grief took one from the line. The others held formation a little longer, then scattered as the sea found the new taste and demanded more. Discipline stilled and then broke. He did not try to gather them. He watched the pattern of their dispersal. Patterns matter. Even here. The pulse above grew stronger by increments too small to name. It was not a promise. It was direction. He discovered he could turn his refusal outward for a moment, the way a man can plant his boots and lend a shoulder to another stumbling, and the cocoon would not immediately thin. He tried it once on a dim flicker near his path. He pushed the shape of Keep into its side the way a swimmer shoves a piece of driftwood toward a child. The flicker brightened and then went out, snatched sideways by a lithe curve of appetite that had been waiting just beyond his notice. The cost to his shell was immediate. A coldness, a drag, a vein of black spreading like ink from a cracked nib. He did not try again for a long while. Charity is a hymn there. But hymns draw choirs, and not all choirs are kind. When exhaustion made even refusal thin, something changed that was not him. The pressure from above flattened the chop. The predator's songs fell an octave and lost their sweetness. The color bled toward a dull iron. He recognized the movement with a start that had no body to shake him. Translation. Somewhere, some great hull was leaving the sea. He rode the standing wave of that departure the way a weed rides the wake of a barge. For a while he moved faster with less pain. In the lee of the cutting absence the Geller field left, he tasted clean nothing. It felt like cold water on a burned tongue. He remembered the idea of sleep and did not dare take it. He passed within a hair's breadth, if hairs exist where hairs burn, of a shape like a spear of noon hammered through fog. It hurt to be near it. It hurt the way a splinter hurts when a surgeon touches it with dry steel, and you know you will be whole afterward, but not yet. If that was the Astronomican, it was not a star. It was a command that brooked no reply. He did not so much move toward it as cease to refuse it. The cocoon narrowed to a wire and sang. The song was one note long held. Predators fled or fell still as if listening. The sea gathered its might and shoved back with every mood men had ever had. The wire held and the note did not break, and for an interval without name he understood nothing, not even the shape of himself. When understanding returned, the sea had fallen behind like thunder that has not yet reached the hill. The cocoon opened by degrees. He was no brighter, but he was less cornered. Ahead in the long gray, a structure uncoiled like a memory of architecture. Buttresses of intention, vaults of duty, a nave of endless breath. He did not know if it lay near Terra, or if all directions there resolve into that single idea when a certain distance is crossed. He only knew that his wire of a self was being drawn along its central aisle, as a mote is drawn along the path of a sunbeam through dust. If you asked a confessor what happens then, he would tell you the emperor receives the faithful and judges the rest. If you asked a navigator, she would tell you the currents compress and align and that what you feel as judgment is navigation. If you asked a psyker like Ethus and found him on a day he had no wish to perform, he might say quietly that a few are taken up into the work and that most are not, and he would not define the work. Delancourt in his wire-thin self did not ask. He moved into a place where questions become shapes you cannot carry. And one of two things would happen. He would thin to something useful and vanish into utility, or he would keep enough of a name to drift, echoing, back toward the places where men light candles and listen to the vox and sometimes hear what they need to hear when they need to hear it. Behind him, eddies closed. Ahead, the nave brightened imperceptibly. He did not pray. He did not remember how. He remembered a voice that had once been his saying 3 words to a man in a trench, and he held to that voice without making it a god. The architecture leaned closer. The note held. The sea, for a handful of knot breaths, went quiet. Silence in the warp is never silence. It is the absence of screaming long enough for memory to rise. And memory, when left alone, learns to speak. The sea settled into stillness. A glassy calm stretched across an infinite horizon. Beneath its surface, light flickered. Not the radiant kind of stars, but the dim phosphorescence of thought, of remembrance. Each pulse was a story that refused to die. Each glimmer an echo of faith or fear. Some burned for seconds, others for centuries, and none could say why. Dalen Core, or what he had become, floated among them, no longer a soldier, not yet nothing. The shape of his self had thinned into translucence. He could not feel the tug of the sea as before, nor the gnawing hunger of the predators. Something protected him now, or perhaps simply ignored him. Above and below him the echoes drifted. He began to see patterns in their light, the faint alignment of faiths, the rhythm of shared devotion. It was like watching a choir's breath long after the song had ended. He reached for one. His hand, or the idea of it, passed through the echo and drew out an image. A manufacturing worker kneeling before a rusted aquila, her face covered in soot, her lips moving in unbroken prayer as flames consumed the hab around her. She died kneeling, whispering gratitude. The moment froze in eternity, replaying endlessly. Core withdrew, shaken. The prayer had outlived the body. That was when he understood. Not all who died were devoured. Some left imprints, fragments of self woven into faith so completely that they could not dissolve. They became echoes, reverent, lost, endless. The Imperium was full of such persistence. Saints who bled light, relics that whispered, machine spirits that grieved. Perhaps these were their origins, the voices of those who refused to stop serving. The thought gave him warmth, and the warmth gave him shape again. He drifted deeper among the lights, drawn by curiosity. The sea dimmed around him, and he found himself entering what could almost be called a cathedral. Not a physical place, but a convergence of countless echoes, all bound by the same gravity, belief. It rose before him as a vast architecture of light and shadow, built from memory and devotion. The pillars were made of prayers endlessly spoken. The walls shimmered with unfulfilled vows. Choirs of souls murmured in the distance, their words overlapping, never-ending. And at the center stood something monumental. Not alive, not dead. A figure of golden fire, faceless, immense, its body made of 1,000,000 fragments of human thought. He could not tell whether it was watching him. The figure's outline rippled like sunlight through smoke. Around its feet swirled the remnants of saints, translucent forms clutching relics, holding wounds that no longer bled. They chanted without pause, voices rising in rhythms that echoed the heartbeat of the Astronomican. Core felt himself drawn toward the figure. It was not the Emperor, no mortal thing could claim that. Yet it bore his image, sculpted by faith and desperation. Perhaps it was an echo of the echo, a reflection of the Emperor's worship made real by 1,000,000,000 prayers. A monument of belief so intense it gained form within the warp. He knelt without knowing why. The act was reflex, ingrained from a lifetime of obedience. Around him other echoes did the same. They bowed, wept, and whispered the same phrases over and over. The figure radiated calm but also distance. Its light did not warm. It preserved. He realized with a shudder that the souls here were not at rest. They were bound by their own devotion. Each whisper fed the figure, and the figure in turn sustained them, a perfect circle of faith consuming itself forever. Some part of Core admired the beauty of it. Another recoiled. Was this salvation? To be an eternal prayer trapped in its own echo? A voice spoke behind him. You shouldn't linger here. He turned. The speaker stood like a man but flickered between outlines. Soldier, priest, psyker, as if indecisive about which memory to wear. His eyes were coals glowing faintly. He carried the weight of recognition, the posture of someone long accustomed to command. Who are you? Core asked, though speech was meaningless here. The words carried through thought. Names don't matter here, the shade replied. Only memories do, and yours are still your own. That makes you dangerous. Core studied him. Where am I? The figure gestured to the luminous cathedral around them, where the faithful come when they refuse to stop serving, where belief outweighs oblivion. He paused, tilting his head as if listening to the murmurs that surrounded them. Most think this is paradise. Some call it the Emperor's shadow. I call it what it is in another battlefield. The words unsettled him. Battlefield. The shade smiled faintly. Faith feeds him, but faith also feeds them. The ones beyond. The predators you ran from. Every prayer is an offering. Every emotion a signal. The warp doesn't care whom you worship, only that you feel. He looked back at the faceless idol, at the souls orbiting it like moths around flame. Then it sustains the warp? In part, the shade said. And yet without this, humanity would fall. The Emperor's light burns because billions believe it should. He is both our savior and our snare. The The idea should have been heresy, but heresy meant nothing here. Kor could feel the truth of it, the terrible symmetry. The Emperor's faith pushed back the darkness, but that same faith illuminated the sea, giving form to monsters that should have remained unseen. He turned back to the shade. "And you? Why are you here?" "I fought for Cadia," the figure said simply. "Held the line when the sky fell. When I died, I thought I'd wake in his light. Instead, I found myself here, leading a chorus that doesn't end." His eyes burned brighter for a moment, and Kor glimpsed cities aflame, titans collapsing, and a fortress world breaking apart. "I tried to leave. You can't, not once the prayer takes hold." Kor looked again at the idol, the vast glowing amalgam of human devotion. Its surface shifted, revealing momentary shapes, faces of saints, of soldiers, of martyrs, each one whispering their creed. The sound was beautiful and horrifying at once. The shade's voice softened. "If you still remember who you are, don't let it take you. Keep that memory close. It's the only thing that keeps you from joining the choir." As he spoke, the idol's light pulsed once, twice. The souls around it stirred, their chanting growing louder. The entire cathedral began to vibrate. The figure of golden fire raised its hands, and the warp responded. Kor felt the sea roar back to life outside the sanctuary, currents tightening, predators awakening. The idol's radiance surged like a flare in the dark, and for the first time, Kor saw what lay beneath it. An abyss, vast and endless, hungry even for faith. The idol was not an anchor. It was a drain, a vortex of worship pulling everything into its center. The shade's hand gripped his arm. "Now you see, the faithful feed the light, and the light feeds the storm." The golden radiance began to consume the echoes, pulling them upward in spirals of burning thought. The choir's voices merged into a single scream of adoration, and within that scream, Kor felt the faintest ripple of something familiar, the same golden pulse that had drawn him this far. But this light was not the Astronomican. It was something smaller, closer, and far more personal. A memory of a lantern carried by an old confessor, the glow of faith on a dying world. It was not command. It was compassion. He looked at the shade. "There's another light." The figure's expression faltered. "Then go. Before this one takes you." The idol's arm stretched outward, its brilliance becoming unbearable. The cathedral trembled, its walls dissolving into molten hymns. Kor felt the pull, gentle, insistent. To surrender would be easy. To become one with the faith, to forget himself, to burn forever in divine purpose. But the memory of his sister's laughter, faint and fragile, pulled against that gravity. It reminded him of mornings on Kether Prime, of rain on steel rooftops, of the scent of oil and bread. Small things, human things. He turned away from the light, and for the second time since dying he refused. The sea responded. The cathedral shattered. Light collapsed into shadow. The idol's scream became silence, and Kor fell once more, downward, into the dark between prayers. He fell into a darkness that was not empty so much as starved. A room after a funeral where even the chairs remember. The shock of refusing the choir left his shape thin and bright, an outline scratched into glass. The sea pressed in with that slow, patient cruelty that is only the absence of care. He waited for the predators to return, for the gentle voice with too many mouths, for the old offers to wear new faces. Nothing came. The dark held like a held breath, and into that stillness another kind of light appeared. Not gold, not command, but the dull red pulse of an ember carried in a pocket for later. It smelled impossibly of iron and old oil. The ember was a memory, but not his. It beat with the rhythm of servos and cant, of binary hymns hummed through vox grills by voices that were never meant to sing. He reached toward it, and the dark flexed aside like a curtain. He stepped, if stepping can be done by what is almost not a man, into a narrow world of corridors and rivets. The machine light revealed itself as sorrow. It clung to the walls like condensation, a thin, persistent damp of regret built up over centuries of orders obeyed and tasks performed, and small failures tallied with unbearable care. In the middle of that sorrow stood a frame of adamant and sanctified steel, shaped like a shrine with a throne inside it, a sarcophagus wired to a rib cage of weapon limbs, its armor curtained with purity seals so old their ink had bled into the parchment. The dreadnought slept. Around it incense smoked and soot haloed every bolt head. The sorrow had a voice. At first it was only ventilation, a tone falling at the end of its cycle like a sigh. Then it became a line of Binharik flattened into something almost like speech. Welcome, honored one, we remember. He should not have been able to understand, but he did. The machine spirit was not greeting him. It was praying. A ritual loop, a thread worn smooth by being fingered again and again. The prayer's shape showed him its history. A battle brother once woke within that iron coffin to the sound of a familiar chant and answered with slaughter until silence fell. Afterward, the spirit returned to its wardens and learned that waiting is work, and work is worship. When the one within finally died in the manner of those who cannot die, the spirit kept praying to something it could not name, its devotion seeping into the metal until the voxcasters remembered the voice that had answered. Sometimes, across the years, when a chaplain passed alone after Compline, the coffined guns would ghost tilt toward him, seeking a target that was only a hole where a name had been. He touched the prayer and it shivered, noticing him for what he was. Not an oath of oil, not a rightsman with a censer, but a human absence shaped like a man. It offered him a small place in its loop, a howlingly humble seat among the repeated lines. To sit there would be to be warmed and wanted. He would become a syllable. He almost took it. He almost rested, but the memory of the idol's drain still rang in him like a tooth struck by a cup. He had seen how sustenance and surrender can be the same gesture when the sea is hungry. He thanked the spirit as well as he knew how to thank. A gesture, not a word, and moved on through the corridors of that sorrow until the walls thinned and the ember went with him like a coal on a shovel. Small heat carried from one fire to another before both go dark. He surfaced into a chapel built in the shape of a wound, stone ribs arched over an altar stitched with wire. There, a relic lay. A knuckle of bone bound in brass, sleeved in wax seals, set upon a cushion that remembered more hands than it would ever count. The bone's echo held firm the way a knotted rope holds the memory of the hands that pulled it. He felt 100 cities kneel and rise in the tension of that knot, 1,000 vows delivered into its custody. Saints are not born to the warp. They are built there out of what the living will not let go of. He listened, and in the bone's slow heat he heard a woman's voice, the manufactorum kneeler from before, but steadied now, no longer trapped at the moment of dying. Her prayer had elongated, grown patient, learned to bend without breaking. The relic did not drain her. It held her like a child's picture, holds a face that will never be seen again and becomes more true for the keeping. He drew back and the chapel fell away because it had never been a place so much as a posture made by 1,000 kneeling backs. In its place rose a long corridor lit by a single lantern, its veil shading the flame to a patient amber. He knew that light like a smell. The old confessor walked before him, the same careful stride, the same unheeded courage, lantern in one hand and the other hand always slightly lifted because there are rooms the living must pass where a hand looks like a blessing even when it is only there to balance the weight. You again, the confessor said without turning. His voice made no sound on the floor because there was no floor, only the shape men give to passage when they can't bear to admit they are falling. I hoped you'd find the quiet path after the singing. Not everyone does. I stepped away, Kor said, and was mildly astonished to find there was enough of a mouth left in him to say it. I don't know if that was right. Right is a word for tables and codes, the confessor said. The lantern flickered as if remembering a draft. Here you have smaller words: keep, hold, give, refuse, pray if you can, and if you can't, make a space where a prayer could stand if it arrived. He caught up so they walked together, light to his left, the long darkness deep to their right. The lantern did not burn the sea. It simply made a little room in which the sea chose not to enter. They passed a doorway in which a Skitaria stood motionless, red cloak crusted with the dust of 100 worlds. He was not a man, not entirely. What remained of his humanity hung on him like a charm pinned to a child's shirt. Yet even in him, even in that lattice of augmetic law, there was a small echo of fear trained into obedience until it became a taste the predators disliked. The sharp metal tang of duty that does not sing. In the threshold's lintel, letters had been carved, then filed down, then carved again. The confessor did not look. Habit is the most powerful ward. Do you know where this leads? Kor asked. The lantern cast their shadows forward. They reached into the dark like words written ahead of their mouths. Forward, the old man said, and his smile was tired and fond, as if speaking to a child insisting a map should bleed when pricked. Sometimes back. Never out, he paused. But there are doors that open onto warmer rooms. I've seen a few. They came to such a door. It had no handle and no hinges. It had the feeling doors have when you know your hand will pass through if you push, but you hesitate because the wood still looks like wood. On the far side lay the thin place Cor had found before, the Isle of Intention, the nave of the long breath, the spear of noon hammered through fog. Closer now. The air, if air can exist where breath is an idea, tasted of iron again, and of something cleaner like linen dried in cold wind. If you go, the confessor said, and here his voice held a grain it had not held before, you may not come back the way you are. You may be thinned to a line and drawn into work that will never let you hear your own name again. The faithful tell me that is a crown. I am not faithful enough to say so. I carry a lamp and talk to the dying, and I find that is as much creed as my bones can hold. Cor thought of the idol that fed itself with prayers, and of the relic that held a woman's patience without bleeding her dry, and of the dreadnought that remembered obedience so tenderly it had learned to mourn. He thought of a sergeant in a trench hearing 3 words in an impossible clarity, and planting his boots because a voice had taken the trouble to cross a storm to reach him. He felt along his thinned edges the pull of the spear, the command that was not promise. He did not imagine judgment as a throne. He imagined labor, light carried up a long stair by hands that would forget they were hands. Will I be used? He asked, because it was the only question that mattered to soldiers when no other answers remained. If you are taken, the confessor said, you will not be wasted. He tilted the lantern so its veil made a little crescent of shadow on the door. And if you are not, you will still have enough of a voice to do what you have already done. Sometimes that's more than it sounds. The sea stirred beyond the corridor's walls, reminded by their quiet that something was being decided. The predators did not dare the lantern, but their attention gathered like frost along the edges of its light. The door waited. Beyond it, the long nave brightened by a hair, and the note he had once become rose until it threatened to cut him through. He placed his hand, the idea of it, the remaining curve, against the knot wood. It yielded. Cold rushed in. Far away, a million throats shaped a single breath they would never exhale. He stepped. What lay ahead could not be called a place, but men have always called it something when they wake sweating with the taste of iron and linen on their tongues. It is the road that climbs toward a light no eyes can look at and keeps climbing when the knees are gone. It is the echo of a will that says do and nothing else. It is where the faithful insist the emperor gathers his own, and where navigators insist the currents align, and where psychers like Ethos, if you catch them on days when they are old enough to be honest, admit that a few are taken up into a labor that makes the galaxy traversable, and the rest are left to haunt the margins and keep the trenches steady. He went forward, and the corridor behind him thinned to a thread, and the lantern's cramped warmth dwindled like a remembered hand. Ahead work waited. Not punishment, not reward. Work. The sea rolled over the threshold and could not follow. Somewhere behind him, a lantern lifted, turned, and walked back the other way because there were still wards to visit, and the living do not stop dying while decisions are made. Somewhere ahead a note lengthened, and Dalen Cor's outline became thinner than wire and did not break. If you have ever wondered how the Astronomican keeps its shape against a storm that has learned the taste of prayers, then you have wondered what happens to some of the souls that refuse to vanish. There are answers men shout from pulpits. There are answers whispered in navigator houses. There is also this, a stare, a command, a labor without a name. There are no clocks where he wakes, no sky, no distance, only the sense of rising through brightness that has forgotten what darkness is. The warp's colors fall away one by one, stripped like paint until nothing remains but the impression of motion and the soundless pressure of purpose. If time exists here, it is measured in obedience. The first thing Cor understands is labor. Not effort in the human sense, or no muscle or bone left to obey, but the unending translation of will into motion. The light that fills him is not warmth. It is instruction. It asks nothing, promises nothing, yet demands everything. Around him are others countless, their outlines like threads in a single cable. Together they move, though none remembers choosing to. The sea churns beyond them, kept at bay by the geometry of this command. From the outside, mortals call it the Astronomican, the Emperor's light, the great psychic beacon that cuts through the warp and guides humanity's ships. From the inside, it is something else entirely. He is part of it now, or near it, a fragment among fragments, each one singing the same wordless note that stretches across reality. The choir is not made of living psychers alone. Their bodies fuel the beacon, yes, the living conduits of faith and pain that keep the fire fed. But among their screams and their prayers drift other voices, quieter, colder, echoes like core drawn into the orbit of the Emperor's shadow. They are not saints. They are not saved. They are the residue of humanity's refusal to end, will hardened into function. Each retains a sliver of memory, just enough to understand what they have become, but not enough to rebel against it. They feel the Emperor's presence not as vision or voice, but as gravity, a force so immense that resistance cannot even be imagined. To be near him is to cease being an individual, and to become a syllable in an eternal command. Sometimes through the brilliance, Core glimpses flickers of what may be Terra, the golden throne's reflection bleeding through reality, a monument of metal and bone surrounded by oceans of machinery. But whether he truly sees it or only feels its echo in the warp, he cannot tell. Around him, the other fragments pulse in rhythm with the beacon's heartbeat, their song steady, unwavering. It is beautiful. It is horrifying. He remembers the confessor's words, "If you are taken, you will not be wasted." Now he understands. The light is not cruelty. It is efficiency. In a galaxy that would devour mankind without mercy, the Emperor wastes nothing, not even the souls of the dead. There are moments when the song falters, brief tremors that ripple through the fabric of the beacon like cracks in glass. In those instants, Core senses whispers from beyond, voices clawing at the edges of the light, demons pressing against the barrier, testing its strength. The souls nearest the edge burn brighter, their essence flaring like torches until they vanish, consumed by their own devotion. The light holds, but each pulse costs something. He begins to understand the balance. The Emperor's will pushes outward, the warp pushes back. The beacon burns through both, and every moment of its existence is a negotiation written in suffering. Humanity travels the stars by the power of its own pain. Through it all, Core's memory persists, a faint imperfection in the perfect rhythm. He remembers Barrispine, the trenches, the voice that said, "Hold the line." That phrase lives inside him like a knot in metal, small, immovable. Sometimes when the song threatens to dissolve him completely, he repeats it to himself. "Hold the line." It has no meaning here, yet it anchors him, a trace of identity in the endless chorus. The other fragments notice. One by one, their lights flicker in response, not in defiance but in recognition. The words spread without sound, echoing through thought rather than voice. "Hold the line," a phrase meaningless to gods but sacred to men. For a heartbeat, the song of the Astronomican changes, its tone shifting almost imperceptibly. The warp hesitates as though remembering fear, then the light stabilizes again. The Emperor's will reasserts itself, immense and silent. Yet Core knows something has altered. A microscopic flaw in the machinery of eternity, born from a human word, somewhere in the material galaxy, aboard a void ship thousands of light years away. A navigator opens her third eye and feels the beacon flicker. For a fraction of a second, she perceives not the Emperor's face, but a soldier's silhouette, standing in ash, lays gun in hand, refusing to fall. She gasps, blinks, and the vision is gone. The ship stays its course. The crew never knows how close they came to drifting blind. Back in the light, the fragments settle. Core drifts again, his will folded into the structure of the song. He does not know how long he remains there. Time has no meaning when each moment is an eternity. Yet eventually something stirs beneath the brilliance, a shadow moving through light. At first he thinks it is another distortion, a ripple caused by demonic pressure. But this shape moves differently, purposefully. It passes between the threads of the choir like smoke through sunlight. Where it touches, the song dims, not from corruption but from reverence. The shadow pauses before him. It has no form, no face, and yet he knows it sees him. "Why are you here?" it asks. The voice is not heard but felt, vast, resonant, ancient beyond reckoning. It carries no malice, only weight. Core does not answer, he cannot. The question is too large, the shadow moves closer. "You were not called to this," it says. "You were claimed." 1,000 meanings coil inside that word. Claimed, not chosen, not summoned, but taken. The light around him trembles. The other souls recoil instinctively, their harmony disrupted. The Emperor's gravity tightens as though to contain the intrusion. But the shadow does not flee. It stands calm amid the radiance. I remember you, it murmurs. You spoke when silence ruled. You carried a word through the sea. Kor tries to speak, to ask what it is, but his voice collapses under the weight of its presence. The shadow seems to understand. You think this is salvation, it says. It is not. It is service. And service, even eternal, is still a kind of death. The brilliance of the Astronomican flares around them, almost in warning. The shadow does not waver. There are other paths, it says softly. Other labors. Other wars. For a moment, the light and the shadow stand together, each defining the other. Kor feels the pull of both, the warmth of purpose and the chill of freedom. The shadow extends something like a hand. You may stay, it says, and be part of the flame. Or you may fall again, and carry what you have learned into the dark. Kor looks into the radiance and feels the hum of 1 billion human souls, burning to keep humanity alive. He looks into the shadow and feels the vast unknown beyond the light, where the dead whisper and the forgotten still fight. He remembers the confessor's lantern, the soldier's voice, the machine's prayer, the relic's patience. He understands that both choices are the same, service, one within the light, one within the dark. He takes a breath, a gesture without lungs, and steps toward the shadow. The light does not resist. It merely watches as he fades from its edge. The threads of the choir closing behind him. The last thing he hears is not command but gratitude, and then once more he falls. Falling with the shadow was not like drowning. It was like stepping out of a loud room into cold night, and feeling the world recalibrate around your breath. The radiance of the Astronomican narrowed to a seam of brightness on a far horizon, a blade edge of command cutting the storm from pole to pole. Here, beyond that edge, the sea resumed its old habits, hunger, mimicry, the long patience of things that do not sleep. Yet a new geometry moved through it, quiet and deliberate, like ink spreading through water without turbulence. The shadow traveled within that geometry. Kor learned to follow. Names do not hold here, but mortals give them anyway. Navigators speak, in houses that never open their shutters, of lanes that do not appear on any chart. Cold paths that cross the Imperium, with none of the usual singing. Choir masters, when the incense is low and the watch is long, mutter about slack in the beacon, tiny unaccounted harmonics that arrive when they are most needed and depart before anyone can measure them twice. The Ordo Hereticus has a phrase they use only in parchment that burns itself after reading, the Emperor's shadow. Perhaps this was that, or perhaps it was only a superstition wearing a useful mask. Kor did not demand proof. He recognized the work. Tasks announced themselves as absences. A swell that should have crested did not. A predator that should have tasted a convoy lost the word for appetite and drifted, blinking until its body remembered hunger and turned aside too late. Somewhere a pilgrim ship translated into a region that had been read on the navigator's map, and yet the chaff of the sea lay down like wheat before a wind no one felt. Nothing here declared itself as salvation. The shadow did not roar. It rested a hand on the wheel at 3 a.m. and corrected a degree. Kor learned how to be a correction. Not a flare, not a trumpet, not a miracle to be told and retold. A weight added to a scale where mathematics cannot go. He pressed on eddies until their spirals loosened. He sharpened the flavor of duty in the water where troops were about to break, a clean metallic tang that the predators disliked to taste. He thickened the memory of a vow at a relic's side so the siphon the sea had lowered, there struck stone and slid off. He did not decide these labors. He felt the shadow pause, and the work revealed itself the way a wound reveals what it needs when a competent hand unwraps it. Then it was done, and no mark remained but the absence of a disaster. Sometimes the shadow spoke, not in words but in vectors. Once it rested beside him in a province of the sea that tasted of copper and ash and laid out, with a tactician's plainness, a knot he could not untangle alone. Something vast was drawing near a Geller wake. Not a demon precisely, but a thought that had learned to live too long and had grown teeth out of loneliness. In its slipstream drifted a skiff of human minds, a patrol boat out of Cipramundi translating hot, shields patched, the navigator on her 3rd night of holding the eye open on stimulants and prayer. Kor felt the skiff's tiny denial cutting water and the older thought turning, curious the way a leviathan turns when a lamp trembles on the surface. He reached for the old tools, refusal, the wire, the one-held note, and felt them bite but not hold. The shadow flowed past him and widened, not to block but to suggest. It showed the thought an older flavor, a hunger satisfied elsewhere, a memory of a feast already eaten. The leviathan considered, something like melancholy passing through its mass, and let the skiff pass, turning away with the dignity of a predator that declines bait without understanding why. The patrol boat never knew. A junior officer wrote in a log that the translation was remarkably smooth. Praise be. And the log became insulation for a cogitator housing and then dust. On other nights, the work cut closer to the bone he no longer wore. Voices rose from trenches and chapels, from medici barges and manufactura miles, and the sea built bridges to them because rhyme loves rhyme. Cor learned to break the meter again. He taught a prayer to limp. He taught a hymn to hitch on a rough word so that a thing outside would trip on the snag and miss the door. He watered courage until it tasted a little like boredom. Predators seldom drink boredom deeply. He salted despair until it became anger. And anger, while dangerous, is at least a human weapon men can point in a chosen direction. He went back once to a lane he recognized only by the ache it left in him. The echo of a lantern angled its veil to him in greeting. No words, only the small courtesy of light made narrower to press more deeply into a seam. The confessor did not lift his face. He did not need to. The gesture was the man. Cor understood that some labors are lifetime long, and some outlast lives and wear them like sleeves. He stood a moment beside the lantern and remembered, with a gratitude that did not kneel, what a hand looks like when it blesses and means it. There were temptations. The choir called sometimes, not with the hungry gravity of the idol, but with the clean summons of a straight line. The spear of noon rang down the sea, and in its vibration lay the offer to be wire again, to sing one held note and be part of the engine that keeps man from becoming a rumor told by ruins. Each time the offer came, he measured his thinness. Each time the shadow waited without reproach. A few times he leaned toward the light until his edges smoked. A few times he went on with the work in the dark because a small ship somewhere forgot to be afraid and needed the fear put back into it so it would check its seals twice. He failed. It is necessary to admit it. In a black buoyed reach where the sea tastes like hot iron for reasons no map records, he tried to pull a little raft of souls out of a world that had learned their names too perfectly. He touched them and the names became doors, and the doors opened inward onto the same room, and the room closed behind them with the quiet of a hand laying a child down for a nap. He burned a long time after that, not in pain but in uselessness. The shadow did not console him. It moved on as the tide moves, willing to be grieved, unwilling to be stopped. He followed thinner, quieter, and learned to let sorrow be weight rather than fire. The sea is full of memorials with no stones. You carry them or you don't. Carrying is work. From time to time, a living mind brushed him and kept a touch. Ethis Vale, because some names insist, paused in a corridor between wards and frowned at a wall as if listening for mold in the paint. A navigator on a different ship blinked salt from her third eye and thought she heard a drill sergeant's cadence folded into the beacon's tone for one impossible beat. A sister bent over a dying man and felt very softly, a correction to the line she had said 1,000 times, as if someone who knew its shape better had taken her hand and guided the pen. None of them would swear to it. None of them needed to. If labor is prayer here, then acknowledgement is a kind of answer. So the shadow worked and Cor with it, trimming currents, souring flavors, setting small weights on scales men would never see. The Astronomican burned and ships found their ways and predators fed elsewhere or later or not at all. No ledger tracked what was spared. No pulpit told this creed. Perhaps that is why it held. And yet even in this quiet, the sea remembered its nature. Far off a tremor ran. Not pressure from the light, not the leisurely turn of an old hunger, but a convulsion that began everywhere at once. The storm darkened in a way that is not color and tightened in a way that is not distance. A choir somewhere missed a breath. A dozen navigators opened eyes they had sworn closed. The lantern's veil fluttered with no draft. The shadow stilled, listening. Something was coming. Not toward the light, not toward the shadow, but up from beneath both. Like a continental shelf lifting under a tide and making a new coast where no map has ever placed one. Cor felt the human part of him tighten around a word he had carried since trenches and smoke. Hold. The shadow inclined toward him, a gesture of agreement without hierarchy. The sea rose. When the sea rose, it did not roar. It simply changed its mind. The motion was total. From the smallest eddy to the great unseen deeps beneath creation, everything began to lean toward something that had no name. The shadow paused beside Kor, and for the first time since he had joined its work, he felt uncertainty ripple through it, not fear, but a hesitation so immense it felt almost reverent. Far beyond, the Astronomican blazed. Its light surged, flaring with a brightness that tasted of iron and tears, cutting through the sea like a blade through fabric. Every human mind across the galaxy that could feel its pulse, psychers, navigators, dreamers in their sleep, flinched at once, sensing something vast pressing against the veil of reality. Even demons turned their heads the way beasts look up when the forest goes still. Something was coming through. Kor could not see it directly. Nothing in the warp could bear its shape. But he felt the weight of it. Not like the entry of a god, but the awakening of an idea too old for language. It was the memory of everything the sea had swallowed. All the voices, all the faces, all the prayers and oaths and screams devoured since the first human died, now moving as one current. It was not mercy. It was not vengeance. It was the sea remembering itself. The shadow's voice came through the dark, quiet and level. The warp has learned to answer. The thought terrified him. The warp had always been reaction, chaos mirroring the living. But this felt deliberate, unified. The predator had begun to think. Every lost soul, every echo that had burned and faded, was now part of something that knew what it was. Not a god. Not quite, but awareness, and it was looking at the light. The sea surged toward the Astronomican, not as a storm but as a tide, vast, patient, inevitable. The beacon flared in defiance, its golden fire swallowing a million sacrificial screams as living psychers on Terra died in synchrony, feeding the machine that kept mankind safe. The collision was silent. Where light met sea, reality bent, folded, and screamed in colors too bright to name. The shadow moved first. Hold, it said. Not to Kor, but to everything around him. The command was not shouted. It was remembered. The shadow flared outward, not in light, but in shape. A geometry of calm that spread across the approaching tide. For a heartbeat, it held the impossible. Order against hunger. Kor felt himself drawn into its core, his essence stretched thin, becoming another line in the diagram of defiance. He had thought he understood service before. He had been wrong. Service here was not obedience. It was endurance. The sea struck. Every thought he had ever carried, every borrowed prayer, every fragment of memory still clinging to him was stripped bare. He saw himself through the sea's gaze, not as a man, not even as a soul, but as a question the universe had not yet answered. His resistance was not noble. It was microscopic, but in the warp, even the smallest act of will could shift eternity's current. Hold, he whispered, though he no longer knew if he spoke for himself or for humanity. The shadow trembled. The sea pressed harder, an ocean of every death mankind had ever given it. In that pressure, Kor felt the faces of the lost brushing past him. The manufactorum worker, the Cadian shade, the woman's kneeling prayer, the machine spirit's sorrow. None of them were gone. They were part of this tide, pleading without words, remember us. And for the first time since his death, Kor understood what the warp truly was. It was not hell. It was memory. Every thought, every fear, every devotion humanity had ever cast into the dark. All of it still existed here, endless and unfinished. The warp was humanity's reflection, magnified beyond control. It was what happens when a species tries to forget itself and fails. The realization did not break him. It steadied him. He turned his face, if he still had one, toward the oncoming flood. You are what we made, he said, and we will unmake you the same way. The shadow's geometry shifted, folding around his defiance, amplifying it. The words were not defiance to the sea, they were definition. The warp feeds on thought, and now the thought it tasted was not fear or worship but identity. In that flavor it found confusion. The tide faltered, rippling as if uncertain. Through that hesitation, light bled in, gold, unyielding, mercilessly bright. The Astronomican's beam speared through the gap, burning the sea back into its infinite distance. The collision froze into stillness like frost sealing a wound. The warp recoiled, its awareness folding in upon itself, returning to its endless mutter of hungers and prayers. Silence fell again. Kor found himself adrift, his form dim but intact. The shadow reconstituted beside him, smaller now, its outline frayed at the edges. It won't last, it said quietly. Nothing ever does. The sea forgets its fear as soon as it heals. But we held. Kor could not answer. There were no words left that meant anything. Only the faint hum of the light above and the memory of the phrase that had carried him this far. The same command that had echoed from his dying breath through the Astronomican's choir to this final stand. Hold the line. He looked out across the sea, which once again rolled in deceptive calm. Beneath that surface lay everything, life, death, gods, monsters, indistinguishable. Humanity would keep dying, keep feeding it, keep walking blind into the fire. And every time some part of them would hold the line a little longer. He wondered not with hope but with curiosity, whether that might be enough. The shadow turned toward him, its voice faint as breath. We go on, it said, until the Emperor himself sleeps, until the sea forgets our names. That is the work, and then it was gone. Kor drifted alone. Around him faint lights flickered, new echoes forming, the souls of the newly dead entering the endless tide. Some burned bright with faith, others flickered with despair. Each would choose or be chosen or dissolve. He felt the pull again, upward toward the light, downward into the dark. He understood now that both paths led to the same ocean. He did not fight. He simply opened his mind to the current, letting it take him wherever the next duty waited. Perhaps he would guard a ship's passage. Perhaps he would whisper courage into a dying man's ear. Perhaps he would simply fade. It did not matter. He was not gone. The sea rolled on, patient as eternity, and somewhere in the distance, a whisper echoed through the storm. Not divine, not damning, but human. Hold the line. The tide listened, and, for a moment that no one living would ever feel, it obeyed.